Good afternoon and welcome to the Freedom to Buy podcast, presented by SuperNet. I'm Joe Daworsky, the president of retail banking for SuperNet, which is the only payment network that enables true credit card solutions for the cannabis industry, both merchants and consumers. Each week, our podcast will take you behind the scenes of banking, finance, payments, and technology to help educate both businesses and listeners like you on how to make the most of your purchasing power in the world of credit. My next guest is a seasoned banking executive with over 20 years of experience across the banking and financial services industry. He has personally launched multiple cannabis banking programs as team lead at commercial banks and has acted as consultant to dozens of other financial institutions banking cannabis across the country. Previously, he also held positions as an advisory panel board member for Pace University's Lubin School of Business, as well as served as a member of the Banking and Financial Services Committee for the National Cannabis Association. And finally, he is a veteran of the United States Army. Currently, he is the director for specialty banking with Hanover Bank on Long Island. Please welcome to the show, Peter Su.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
I understand you recently joined Hanover Bank as the director of specialty banking. I assume you're going to be launching a cannabis banking program, but why don't you share for our listeners exactly what your role and responsibilities are and what you're developing over at Hanover Bank?
Specialty banking is financial services code word for high compliance. So anything that is that the compliance department would probably consider high risk. And then, of course, my personal favorite subject is cannabis banking. Part of what my first duty will be to create a cannabis banking program for Hanover. We don't currently have a cannabis program that I'm in the process of building it out.
How long does it usually take to build out a cannabis banking program for an institution that is first getting into the space?
Certainly depends on the scope of perhaps your vision, the knowledge of the team that's involved, everyone's availabilities and things like that. I think we're moving at a pretty good pace, and I expect to be able to launch in another month or two. So, I figure all in, that's going to be about 3 months or so. But if you think about it, starting from scratch, that means writing policy, writing procedure, convincing the board. I mean, it's a lot.
Can you share with our audience, this is an emerging market, if you will, and a lot of people are not familiar with the fact that banking does exist for the cannabis industry. Even though it's not approved on a federal level, there are, a plethora of banks that offer cannabis banking programs for the community. Can you talk a little bit about the size of that market, the number of banks, the direction growth that you see for cannabis banking in the next several years?
It's an interesting discussion, I guess, point. So FinCEN, the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, believe it or not, they track a statistic. So they say that there's just under 700. I think the last number was 695. So let's call it 700. 700 financial institutions across the country that are banking cannabis. Again, that's according to FinCEN. Now, most insiders would agree that that number is way too high. We think it's closer to like 150, maybe 200. The reason why there's a discrepancy is basically how FinCEN comes to that number. What they do is they essentially track who are continuously filing marijuana-related SARs. So in other words, you're an institution and you're filing, either limited or priority cannabis-related SARs.
Can you just explain what a SARS report is for our listeners who are not familiar?
A SAR, suspicious activity report. So there's lots of different SARs, and so in this case, Joe, as you pointed out, it's on the federal level, it is federally illegal, right? So you suspect that there are marijuana-related activities going on in this particular account, you are required to file a SAR on that account. And therein lies the first rub when it comes to cannabis banking. it creates a lot of extra work because of all the SARs. And mind you, you're doing those every quarter. So a typical bank, and I'm sorry, typical, let's say a regional bank. I mean, right now, I only file a handful of SARs a year with the cannabis program. And, God willing, it's a successful one with hundreds of customers. You go from filing a handful to hundreds of SARs. So it is a significant uptick in the amount of work involved. So I would say,
Sure.
we believe, we meaning insiders, people that kind of work in the industry, we think the number is closer to like 150, maybe 200 financial institutions, so banks or credit unions that are banking cannabis. It sounds like a big number, but let's put it into perspective. There's 10,000 financial institutions in America, roughly. So that means that the 700
Well,
number.
you're breaking down the 10,000, both banks and credit unions combined.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you put that into perspective, let's say the 700 number, that's less than 10%, right? And if it's the 150 number, well, then it's a lot smaller than that number there, right? Another thing to consider is that's across the entire country. So we know at this point there's 38 states with a medical program, 23 states with a recreational or adult use program. So that means that in any given state, that there's only a handful of institutions willing to bank cannabis. Having said that, there's a handful of institutions willing to pay cannabis. So if you're a cannabis company, a legal one, obviously, and you are looking for an account, conceptually, you should be able to get banking. So I actually think this idea that there's no cannabis banking available, in my mind, is a little bit of a myth, an urban legend. Now, it is a significantly underbanked industry, right, in terms of capability, capacity, and cost.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's where, a company like SuperNet comes in. Your product, I mean, talk about changing the dynamic of that capability, capacity, and cost. What you're doing is going to be revolutionary.
We feel so as well. Absolutely. And I think that, for myself, coming relatively new to this space, I came out of banking just like yourself, but into the cannabis space is relatively new. I was surprised to find out that a number of my portfolio banks that I dealt with in my prior life had cannabis banking programs. So it seems to me that a number of banks that are getting into the cannabis banking industry, they see the opportunity, but they want to, be under the radar. So it's not well publicized, if you will. I guess there's a little hesitation, but at the same time, they want to be, first to market to capture as much market share as possible before it's approved on a federal level. Do you have you seen that in your travels, that these programs are operating under the radar, if you will?
Actually, I don't know if you know this. It used to be common practice. So in the early days, so we're talking, 5, 6 years ago, let's say, almost every institution that was banking cannabis would actually have their clients sign NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements. In other words, hey, you're a cannabis company, we'll bank you, but please don't tell anybody.
Wow, I didn't realize that. That's interesting.
It was actually common practice to have someone sign an NDA. So you know how in banking, normally when you do a piece of financing, you know how you tout that from the top of the mountain. Right?
Right.
There's a sign outside that building that says this building was financed by so and so. If you think about it, look around. You can Google it. You won't find that in cannabis, but obviously those deals are happening, right?
That
So
is true. That's a
it's
very interesting point.
yeah, so it's sort of interesting. I mean, bank financing is starting to happen in cannabis. Believe it or not, again, another urban legend. It's still limited in scope and heavily tilted towards real estate-based transactions.
And when your program is launched, your goal is to be able to offer all the ancillary services to the industry
That's
as
right.
well.
Yeah. In so much as a commercial bank, you know, whatever a standard bank is doing in just regular commercial banking, my vision is to bring that to cannabis, subject to approvals, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, given that you just joined Hanover and you're building the program, timing couldn't have been better because they just passed, was it last year, cannabis legislation in the state of New York. So that's a positive for your for your institution as you built out the program. How many licenses have been issued and granted in the state of New York, if you know?
So here, not to split hairs, but it's a question of like granting a license and that license actually becoming operational, which is a problem that we are facing here in New York. So just under 300 cultivators in New York and almost 500 retail licenses in the state of New York. But out of that number, and again, this has been, big news for us, right? We've only operationalized something less than 20 of the retail stores. The challenge, as you can see, then is that you've got 200 plus cultivators. So these are growers, right? And last year, so you always have to plan a year in advance, right? They planted a crop. This year, there's no stores to sell those crops to, or there's not enough stores, rather. So unfortunately, that has been a challenge. But from my perspective, the timing kind of worked out because had I tried to start a program, let's say a year ago, well, we would have kind of sat around twiddling our thumbs because there just wouldn't be enough licensees to bank. By the time I launched this program, the New York cannabis program, meaning statewide, looks like it'll be in full bloom, and that's actually good for the bank.
So what has been the log jam in getting these dispensaries up and running and operational if they've been issued the license? What's the obstacle? Is it financing?
It's hard to peg one particular reason. There's a myriad of reasons. I would say financing certainly is a factor. New York also took a very, very strong progressive stance on who's going to get licensed. So the state heavily focused on a particular category of licenses that we're calling CAUD, CAURD. So simply put, if you had a marijuana related conviction in the state of New York, you were prioritized in the licensing process. Now, from a social impact perspective, you can see how, wow, that's great. That's social justice, right? Hey, this was illegal under our laws, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're going to put you at the front of the line for that industry. But Joe, you're an experienced banker. How do we take that person from a compliance, BSA, risk perspective? How do we take that person that has a record and bank them? It's hard.
It's a conundrum. It's a conundrum, to
Yeah.
say the least. But that's interesting. Well, it sounds like there's tremendous opportunity, and the timing is good for you at Hanover Bank. So congrats on that. Now, is Hanover going to be obviously going tri-state and nationwide, or are you just going to focus on the state of New York?
Like any new program, you certainly want to start. You want to crawl, walk, run. So I don't have any specific mandates to stay in any particular lane, but it is prudent, of course, to start in your own backyard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, that's helpful. Now, obviously, we've all read the papers and hear on the news what's going on in terms of banking legislation for cannabis and what's going on in the processing industry. Last year, we heard about the crackdown on cashless ATMs. And as recent as last week, we heard that now MasterCard announces a ban on their debit card transactions for cannabis purchases. Can you talk a little bit about the recent news on MasterCard and what that means for the industry, if you will? You have no cashless ATMs. MasterCard is now, cracking down. What obstacles does that create, and what are your thoughts on where this goes?
My thoughts are with the merchants. I sympathize that a cannabis merchant, has payment issues. When you have payment issues, what do? It's easier to go cash, which is not a problem, right? Cash is king. But what do you do when there's a lot of cash? Well, cash is expensive to deal with. The logistics of it is annoying, it's expensive, and let's be honest, it's potentially a security concern.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
I've
not,
heard there's been on the news, the local news up in the tri-state area, that's
yeah.
been an issue. People, dispensaries getting robbed because of all the cash.
Yeah. I mean, so that's what it really comes down to. It's not as if that this means that the store can't operate. It just means that now you're kind of forced to be cash only. Having said that, so yes, like again, my sympathies, my empathies are with the merchants that are being affected. And again, Joe, you know this idea, this position that some people have taken, where it's like, oh no, Mastercard has cracked down, or Mastercard has taken it has pivoted. That's actually not true. The association, so Mastercard, Visa, et cetera, right? They've been very consistent on this issue, on this topic. They don't want cannabis transactions on their network. They have said this over and over again, right? In the ease case, like they're on record. There's a testimony. This is all public information. So this idea that this is a new position that they've come out, swinging or something like that, that is not true.
Right. They're just cracking down because people are trying to go through the
Yeah,
back door, if you will.
yeah. The fact of the matter is, it's the processors, all these like payment processors that pop up. They seem to pop up, all the time. That decides, well, I found a loophole. I found a way to process this transaction on the Mastercard rail, even though they told me I shouldn't, because I can do it like this, right?
Right.
But then, great, you found a loophole that worked. But then don't act surprised when the loophole gets closed, right? But again, I don't want to sound unsympathetic. As I said, that's why I addressed it first. I want to make it clear I support the cannabis merchants. They should have payment options.
Yeah,
But
I
let's
agree.
not act like the association screwed you over. They have always said the same thing.
Right. Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. I think that, bodes favorably for what we're building over at SuperNet because
Yeah,
we own the rails. We're building our own rails to
right.
operate on, as well as, our own train car, if you will. That's the analogy I use.
Yeah,
The SuperNet card is your train,
yeah,
and the rails is the processor. So we're building that full ecosystem. So we control the tracks and we control who runs on those tracks.
right.
Okay, so therefore there's going to be no gray area, and it's needed for the industry. So we're excited to get this launched, and I think it will be timely given what's
Yeah.
going on in the industry. I'd like to talk a little bit about your experience with some of your articles that you've written for Rolling Stone, which I found very interesting. I know you're a contributor for the Rolling Stone Culture Council.
I've been in banking 20 plus years. I feel like I have a number of accolades, accreditations, licenses. No one is impressed with any of that until I say, oh, I write articles for Rolling Stone. It's like I could say, I mean, you've been
Yep.
on my LinkedIn page. I have 17 certifications. No one cares. The question that they ask me is, oh, I saw your article in Rolling Stone.
I find it interesting, being able to be a contributor to Rolling Stone. So can you talk a little bit about that and this Culture Council? That's what it's called.
Fortunate and honored to be in a position where I am able to contribute articles to Rolling Stone, and obviously, provided they agree and they like it and stuff like that, that they will publish it from time to time. So, I've had a number of articles. Obviously, as a banker, my articles are typically more about the business side of cannabis and banking and financing and things like that. So I try to stay authentic, I guess the term is. I don't typically talk about like products or flavor or stuff like that. I stay in my lane. I mostly talk about, again, the banking, the financing, and the business side of it.
Can we talk a little bit about the safe banking legislation that's been held up? Obviously, everybody, was heavily anticipating something to happen at the end of last year. Nothing happened. Can you talk a little bit about, safe banking and your views and, your thoughts on how that might help or not help at all, with cannabis banking?
Yeah, I had a funny reflection on that recently. I've been in cannabis banking been about 10 years since the legislation was first introduced. And we're on our ninth attempt at passing safe banking. I don't know if this is going to be shocking for anybody, but when the legislation was first introduced, it was introduced as a band-aid. It was considered low-hanging fruit, meaning it was conceptually, it was kind of like, well, hey, look, the nation is far apart. on federal legalization of cannabis. Now, again, contextually, keep in mind, 10 years ago, we only had medical cannabis, right? So we're talking the early days of California, Colorado, et cetera. The basic message was, well, we're really far apart on federal legalization, but hey, we can all agree that legal businesses should have access to banking, right?
Right.
Now, 10 years, 10 years later, we're still talking about safe banking. Really low-hanging fruit anymore? Are we closer to federal legalization than we are to safe banking? I mean, I guess I would think about the practical impact of safe banking at this point in time, right? Like, so 10 years ago was a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
10 years later, again, FinCEN estimates there's almost 700 financial institutions banking cannabis. So if safe banking was to pass, let's say today, what would change? Well, I would think that it's absolutely a good thing because more institutions will get in. They will get into the game. And what will that do? That will help the merchants because there'll be competition. So it'll drive up competition, it'll drive up capacity, it will drive down costs, right? I guess one of the questions would be, and unless you and I won't be able to settle this here. What is what will the final language look like? Because if all we get out of safe banking, and of course we assume this because it's called safe banking, if all we get out of it is a checking account, then let's be honest, not much. Not much is going to change. Now, if it includes language about things like credit cards, loans, listing to the public markets, well, that would be different. That would be a sea change. And I remember the last version of Safe Banking did have some language about ancillary providers. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure if that is the political chess of like, okay, this means credit cards. Net, I think it's a positive. I would love to see it pass. Frankly, it would help my business. The practical impact of it, if we're just talking about banking, meaning checking account, savings account, the practical impact is not much.
Mm-hmm. Well, for those listeners out there who, aren't from the banking sector like ourselves, you know, Hanover Bank is getting into the cannabis banking business. There are about 150, 200, let's say, banks that are banking cannabis, but we haven't passed safe banking. So the question probably people are saying, well, how can they do it? If it's not approved on a federal level, there's no safe banking legislation. Is it okay to what they're doing? How do they report to the regulators? So can you talk a little bit about, obviously all banks have regulators. So how do the regulators view these cannabis banking programs and what hoops do you have to jump through, on a quarterly basis for the call reports and for your audits to satisfy the regulators?
We actually have a pretty well-trodden path at this point. So in 2014, FinCEN, again, the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, did in fact release a set of guidance. So FinCEN 2014 guidance, very cleverly named. So BSA expectations for marijuana-related banking. That is where all this tracking started when they started tracking that number, which again, today they're saying is almost 700, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, believe it or not, that we have a pretty clear set of like, okay, these are our expectations. Our meaning an examiner coming into your bank, your credit union, they will pull out the FinCEN 2014 guidance and say, okay, show me how you're doing this, show me how you're doing that, et cetera, et cetera. Now that said, FinCEN 2014 is a double-edged sword, right? Like it is a copy and paste of the Cole memorandum. The Cole memorandum was originally designed for prosecutors, so state level prosecutors, right? So this is like, federal prosecutors. Point is, it makes sense reading it from a Justice Department perspective. It makes a little less sense reading it from a banking perspective. Certain things are not extremely practical for a bank to enforce. So as an example, there's a clause in there that says ensure that ensure no sales to minors, which, of course we'd all agree on that, but how does a bank ensure that? you
Exactly.
know
Mm-hmm.
we generally just ask the client to attest, right? Like, oh, attest to this.
The banks that are building the framework and the programs, if you will, currently, following the guidelines that have been issued really have a first mover advantage, if you will, before it's approved on a federal level. So, from you said it will help your business, but it seems like right now a limited number of banks, your neighborhood, who are participating. So that gives you, I would think, gives you a leg up to gain some market share. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like I'm inviting more competitors into the pool, in this current environment, so from a banking perspective, I'm specifically speaking to the inverted yield curve.
Mm-hmm.
Deposits cost too much to get, and loans don't make enough. So cannabis is actually the perfect answer for that. You have, in a relative sense, low cost deposits, a captive audience, without much competition, with lesser competition. You have loans that, because there's a perceived risk involved, you can price at a premium. So yeah, you're paying less for it, for the deposit, and you're making more if you're willing to lend.
Exactly, and that's
Yeah,
a perfect ingredient for increasing the NIM, if you will, and that's probably a reason many banks have chosen to get into cannabis banking. Because I know
right.
from my prior life, the banks that I've dealt with the inversion of the curve, what's going on in the economy, they're
Right.
clamoring for deposits, and they're going to the brokered arena, if you will, because, a lot of customers are pulling deposits because of the low rate environment that banks are paying.
Yeah.
A lot of community banks are not passing on the rate increases we've seen by the Fed over the last year and a half plus. I see, all those accreditations on your LinkedIn page.
Which no one asks about. No one ever.
I know. Well, that's why I have to, because no one does. So I think it's interesting. I think it's, informative for our listeners. But I see that you're also a board member for the Asian Cannabis Roundtable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah. So I am the treasurer of Asian Cannabis Roundtable. So, there's a lot of affinity groups, and a lot in cannabis. We are one of the only ones that are Asian focused. So our mission is pretty simple. There's two sides of it. One is advocacy, right? So just, hey, inserting the Asian voice. So our place at the table, if you will. The other side is a little bit more pithy. We're a business development organization. So, frankly, myself and Kristen Jordan, she's the founder, and all the founding members, we kind of looked around the cannabis industry and we realized that there was a lot of Asians in cannabis, and quite a few in prominent positions. Like Kristen, for example, is frequently a keynote speaker at all the big cannabis events. She has ran, large real estate portfolios for the big MSOs. So a very prominent, well-known name in the industry. And our thought is pretty simple. Hey, we want to obviously network with each other, but also promote the next generation of Asians that may want to think about getting into the cannabis industry. Because specifically in the Asian culture, there is a very strong stigma against cannabis. So we're hoping to change that, frankly.
This has been a great interview, Peter. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day as you're building the program over at Hanover Bank to join today's show and speak to our listeners and educate them on, the cannabis banking sector, as well as what you're doing at Hanover Bank. Can you, for those listeners who are in banking or who are dispensaries or MSOs, and they want to learn more about what you're doing at Hanover Bank, how can our listeners find you and reach out to you?
The easiest thing is I'm very active on LinkedIn. So, definitely look me up. It'll be easy to find me. So yeah, I think that's where I am the easiest to reach.
And for those listening, it's Peter. Everybody knows how to Peter, and his last name is Sue, S-U. Peter Sue on LinkedIn. Well, thanks again, Peter, and thanks for listening to Freedom to Buy, presented by SuperNet. You can learn more about our payment network, visiting our website at supernet.ai. You can listen to this episode as well as past episodes of Freedom to Buy by going to cannabisradio.com. You can also get the Cannabis Radio app. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to speaking to you next week on our next Freedom to Buy podcast. Good afternoon, everybody.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.